Correction officers on trial. When the Rikers guards face more time than the inmates, Rikers correction officers exposed. In 2023, a Rikers Island correction officer walked into the same courtroom where he'd escorted inmates for 15 years. This time he wasn't standing guard. He was standing trial. The charges: assault, falsifying records, conspiracy. The victim: a detainee awaiting trial for stealing a cell phone. The evidence: grainy surveillance footage, and a silence that had lasted years. He wasn't the first officer indicted. He wouldn't be the last. For decades, brutality behind Rikers' walls was treated as occupational noise, a necessary violence no one wanted to see. But now the enforcers are becoming the accused, and the system that protected them is cracking under its own weight. When the guards start facing more time than the inmates, what does justice even mean? Rikers Island has always been defined by its chaos, violence, corruption, neglect. But beneath that chaos lies a precise power economy, one that has shielded officers from accountability for generations. Until recently. Over the last decade, a series of investigations, indictments, and civil rights probes have begun to reverse the equation. The result is unprecedented. Correction officers, once untouchable, are now being prosecuted for the very crimes they were supposed to prevent. This documentary examines that inversion of power. How a culture of impunity bred its own downfall. How unions, prosecutors, and politicians built, and then betrayed, a fortress of protection. And what happens when the people trained to enforce control finally lose it? This is not a story about bad apples. It's about a structure that created them, and a justice system forced to put its own machinery on trial. Since its opening in 1935, Rikers Island has maintained a simple rule: control at all costs. Correction officers were not peacekeepers. They were custodians of chaos. Training manuals taught restraint, but culture taught dominance. By the 1990s, violence had become institutional routine. Officers spoke of the program, unofficial beatdowns used to enforce hierarchy. Detainees called it the clockwork. New recruits learned quickly that silence was loyalty, and paperwork was fiction. Internal investigators estimated that by 2010, less than 15% of use of force incidents were accurately reported. Those who told the truth faced retaliation, not from inmates but from colleagues. One retired officer later admitted, "You could get hurt faster for snitching on a guard than for hitting an inmate." Every structure needs protection. For Rikers, that armor was political. The Correction Officers Benevolent Association, COBA, the city's most powerful uniformed union, negotiated contracts that made discipline nearly impossible. An officer caught falsifying a report could appeal through multiple layers of arbitration, each funded by the city itself. By 2015, COBA's legal defense fund exceeded $1.2 million annually. It paid for lawyers, investigators, and public relations campaigns portraying indicted officers as frontline heroes under siege. When the Department of Investigation or federal monitors pushed for accountability, COBA responded with a familiar refrain: morale crisis, staffing shortage, dangerous inmates. The city flinched every time. It was cheaper to tolerate abuse than to risk a correctional strike. Between 2014 and 2020, three converging forces shattered the island's long-standing immunity. The federal consent decree from Nunez versus City of New York, which placed Rikers under outside monitoring. The proliferation of surveillance cameras across every housing unit. The political rise of criminal justice reform after the deaths of Eric Garner, Khalif Browder, and others. Together they produced something the island had never faced before: visibility. Every punch, every falsified log, every slip-and-fall story could now be cross-referenced against time-stamped footage. Officers who had written the same fabricated narratives for years, inmate became combative, minimum force used, suddenly found video showing otherwise. The system's oldest alibi collapsed overnight. The first wave of prosecutions didn't target rookies. It went after veterans, officers with 20 years of service, pensions on the line, families in the outer boroughs. Men and women who had spent their entire adult lives enforcing order in a world without it. Their indictments read like mirror images of the charges they once processed. Assault in the second degree. Conspiracy to obstruct government administration. Falsifying business records. In courtroom after courtroom, they sat behind defense tables in the same brown uniforms they once wore with authority, now symbols of decay. The irony was surgical. But prosecutions only tell half the story. Every officer on trial represents dozens still protected by the code of silence. A culture so ingrained it functions like instinct. Investigators call it institutional mimicry. Junior officers adopt the moral posture of survival. You don't question the narrative, you reproduce it. That's how you get promoted. That's how you stay safe. Even after indictments began, whistleblowers faced exile. One sergeant described being transferred to the suicide dorms after testifying in an internal case, an unofficial punishment disguised as reassignment. Inside Rikers, silence remains the real uniform. To understand why officers break, you have to understand where they work. Rikers compresses human extremes, fear, boredom, rage, into 12-hour shifts. The architecture isolates officers as much as inmates. No natural light. No quiet. No distance from trauma. Psychological studies by the NYU Langone Center, 2018, found correction officers at Rikers exhibited PTSD rates comparable to combat veterans. Sleep deprivation, hypervigilance, moral disengagement, all occupational hazards. In that environment, brutality isn't just tolerated. It's inevitable. When the line between control and cruelty disappears, what begins as procedure ends as pathology. By 2022, public scrutiny had reached critical mass. Videos of guard-on-inmate assaults flooded social media. Federal monitors described systemic brutality unchecked by leadership. The Manhattan DA's office, long reluctant to prosecute city employees, began forming a specialized corrections integrity unit. Within a year, 7 officers were indicted in separate cases, a fraction but symbolically seismic. For the first time in city history, the system's enforcers were facing the same justice they had administered. The walls of the fortress were turning inward. When a correction officer is indicted, the ritual begins. Headlines declare reform in action. The mayor's office calls it zero tolerance. But inside the courthouse, it looks like something else entirely, a procedural dance that takes years to resolve. A typical assault case starts with video evidence. Then comes arbitration, pretrial hearings, and endless adjournments. The same bureaucratic drag that once trapped inmates now shields the accused guards. In one example from 2021, an officer charged with beating a handcuffed detainee appeared in court 19 times before trial. The defense strategy was simple: delay until the public forgets. Justice moves slow enough to exhaust outrage. Behind every defendant is the quiet machinery of COBA, the Correction Officers Benevolent Association. The union provides lawyers, funds expert witnesses, and orchestrates messaging to recast brutality as self-defense. Each case is framed as an assault on law enforcement itself. A leaked 2020 COBA memo instructed members to describe indicted colleagues as heroes criminalized for split-second decisions. The memo wasn't meant for the public. It was a psychological shield for the rank and file. It reinforced a narrative of persecution, that accountability equals betrayal. This mentality turns reform into treason. Even moderate changes like body-worn cameras were opposed as unworkable. Because cameras don't just record violence, they record culture. District attorneys rely on correction officers as witnesses in countless jail-related prosecutions. Charging them means burning future credibility with those same witnesses. Prosecutors, bound by politics, often reduce charges. Assault becomes official misconduct. Perjury becomes false instrument filing. By the time verdicts arrive, felony brutality has been translated into administrative error. The courts preserve the appearance of justice while avoiding its consequences. It's a linguistic laundering system. A former Bronx ADA admitted anonymously, "You can indict an officer. You just can't convict the culture." When an officer is injured on duty, the city pays for therapy, overtime, and disability benefits. When an inmate is injured, the city budgets for settlements. Pain is compensated by category, not by humanity. Trials of officers expose this asymmetry. Defense attorneys parade psychological evaluations. "My client suffers from PTSD due to working conditions." They're often right. But those same conditions, when applied to detainees, are never accepted as mitigation. The message is clear: trauma justifies power, never defiance. The Department of Correction Investigation Division (ID) is supposed to function as an internal watchdog. But watchdogs can't bite their masters. Between 2010 and 2020, ID closed over 2,000 abuse complaints with no disciplinary action. Investigators cite insufficient evidence, even when video exists, claiming footage is inconclusive. In reality, the problem is structural. Investigators are DOC employees, not independent agents. They report to the same command chain as the people they're investigating. Oversight becomes self-observation, a loop with no exit. After Nunez versus City of New York, 2015, a federal monitor was assigned to oversee conditions at Rikers. The monitor's reports read like déjà vu. Excessive force continues unabated, management fails to enforce discipline, staff remain emboldened. The paradox is cruel. Each new report confirms systemic failure, triggering renewed oversight, not reform. The city keeps the monitor in place as proof of accountability, turning supervision into a subscription. By 2024, the federal monitoring contract had cost $28 million, nearly as much as the department's entire training budget. Accountability became another revenue stream. Every public scandal at Rikers follows the same script. Viral video of violence. Statement of concern from City Hall. Announcement of task force, or working group. Months of silence. Budget expansion to address the morale crisis. This choreography ensures that outrage is metabolized into funding. The machine doesn't collapse under scandal, it feeds on it. As one policy analyst put it, Rikers survives because failure is profitable. For some officers, prosecution triggers existential confusion. They are both products and casualties of the same system. Raised to see control as survival, they now face judgment from an institution that trained them to be violent. In confidential interviews conducted by sociologist Jason S. Ellis, 2019, indicted officers described feeling betrayed by the job. One said, "They told us to keep order by any means. Now they say we went too far. Which is it?" That question haunts every trial. Because if brutality is systemic, guilt is collective, and the justice system cannot afford to convict itself. When officers stand trial, cameras return to the courthouse steps. The same imagery once reserved for accused inmates. Chained defendants, family members crying, lawyers making statements. The optics are reversed, but the system is not. Public appetite for justice turns the courtroom into theater. Every verdict becomes a referendum on reform, and every sentence a public relations equation. If the officer is acquitted, critics cry corruption. If convicted, unions cry witch hunt. Either way, the island keeps operating. The show ends, the machinery hums. The first conviction changes the weather. Inside Rikers, officers whisper more, move slower. Union meetings become tense. Commanders circulate new memos about policy compliance. And still, behind the cell doors, nothing changes. The rank and file now live under a double fear. Fear of inmates, and fear of indictment. That tension breeds paralysis. Officers overreact or withdraw completely, creating power vacuums that inmates fill through informal governance. A sociological paradox emerges. The more oversight increases, the less control exists. Correctional collapse hides inside accountability itself. City Hall announces more oversight positions, new ethics workshops, sensitivity training, expanded surveillance, reforms that produce paperwork, not protection. Officers see reform as accusation. Reformers see officers as obsolete. The result is trench warfare through bureaucracy. Every attempt at transparency triggers retaliation through attrition. By 2024, Rikers had over 2,000 officer vacancies, a staffing crisis used to justify renewed overtime budgets and diluted supervision standards. Reform becomes the justification for regression. The island learns to weaponize its own dysfunction. The system now splits into two realities. In the courts, a handful of officers stand as symbols of accountability, names on indictments, faces on press releases. In the jails, a culture unchanged, insulated by collective fatigue. Four-line officers, prosecutions feel arbitrary. They ask, why him? Why not everyone? The randomness corrodes morale. For reformers, each new case feels cosmetic, a public sacrifice to maintain illusion. Neither side wins because the real opponent is the architecture itself. A complex designed to manufacture violence faster than it can be punished. Psychologists studying correctional culture describe it as mutual degradation. Both guards and inmates deteriorate within the same closed loop of hostility. Officers develop cynicism, inmates paranoia, both exhibiting hypervigilance and emotional blunting. They mirror each other until hierarchy is the only distinction left. When an officer goes to trial, inmates watch from television screens in the housing units. Some cheer, others grow silent. Because the spectacle isn't justice, it's recognition. Both sides see themselves trapped in the same machinery, just on different shifts. Each conviction carries a cost, not moral but financial. Every officer convicted triggers lawsuits, pension disputes, and disability claims. The city quietly allocates millions for settlements and back pay. Justice is expensive, corruption more so. Yet no mayor has ever campaigned on dismantling Rikers entirely without facing political ruin. The jail employs thousands, sustains vendors, and anchors union power. It is a city within the city, too valuable to close and too toxic to reform. Every scandal, every prosecution, becomes another installment in a long series of moral bailouts. By now, the trials reveal an uncomfortable symmetry. Officers describe sleepless nights, panic attacks, and moral confusion. Their testimonies echo the same trauma vocabulary used by inmates. The courtroom becomes a mirror, the state prosecuting its reflection. The psychology of power inverts. Justice becomes an Ouroboros. Observers leave asking, if both the jailer and the jailed are casualties, who benefits from the cage? Public discourse reframes the issue as a moral crisis of labor. Are officers villains, or are they workers broken by impossible conditions? Mayors alternate between apology and defense. Governors order studies instead of closures. The Department of Correction remains a political orphan, too costly to fix, too dangerous to abandon. Even as federal receivership looms, city officials stall, citing ongoing reform progress. Its governance by delay, a signature of every American institution on the brink. Journalists, documentarians, and activists seize on the trials as proof of systemic rot. Books appear, podcasts proliferate, true crime channels dissect surveillance footage. But media attention, like Oversight, becomes self-consuming. Every expose reinforces Rikers' mythology as the most dangerous jail in America, while the system itself remains intact. Culture transforms corruption into content, and outrage into entertainment. In the end, only one truth remains. A system that teaches violence cannot punish it without punishing itself. Rikers Island is not merely a place, it is a philosophy, a living monument to the American addiction to control. When its officers go on trial, the nation glimpses the mechanism behind the facade. Law as ritual. Order as illusion. Accountability as theater. The courtroom becomes a confessional for the state's original sin, the belief that safety can be built on suffering. As of 2025, multiple Rikers officers remain under indictment. Most will take pleas. Few will see prison. None will change the structure that produced them. Their downfall will be cited as progress, even as the island continues to devour lives on both sides of the bars. The phrase whispered by an anonymous sergeant during testimony lingers like prophecy. We all work the same sentence. Some of us just get to go home at night. The trials of Rikers officers are not endings. They are echoes, the system speaking to itself in the language of guilt. For decades, those uniforms represented control. Now they represent consequence. And yet, nothing fundamental has changed. The island still turns, the doors still lock, and the city still looks away. Because in America's justice economy, everyone is replaceable, except the machinery itself. The search for truth continues.